Going home. It sounds so simple, and yet it's something that is easy to take for granted. But for so many people displaced by war or disaster, it's an impossibility. I was very moved by my guest this week. Mohamed Yahya is a refugee from Somalia, and he and his family can't go home. But he has just had the incredible privilege of helping whole communities return home to northern Nigeria years after they had to flee from the militant group Boko Haram.
It was very touching. It was the most emotional part of my work. I have been displaced from my own home as a young person at the age of 3, 4 when we left home in Somalia. And a little bit of me was, I must say, envious of them that they're able to go back home. I always imagine how I'll feel when I go back home without fear.
From the United Nations, I'm Melissa Fleming. This is Awake at Night. Mohammed, you like to go by the name of Mo.
Yes.
Okay, so
That's
welcome,
good.
Mo.
Thank you.
And, as we record this, you're just about to take up your new position as the UN Resident Coordinator for Pakistan. And you have just left Nigeria, where you were resident representative of the United Nations Development Program. One of the big projects you worked on in Nigeria was helping communities return to their towns years after they were brutally displaced because of the conflict with the militant group Boko Haram. You have written, Mo, very movingly about watching a community come home in the northern province of Borno. What was that like? What was the welcoming ceremony, and what did you witness?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was a community that had been displaced for over a decade. So for us, seeing families who haven't been at home, who have been in IDP camp, who have lived essentially very difficult lives. These are communities. I'll give you an example of a young lady called Amina. She went back now at 25 years old, and she had left 10 years ago her own home. So she has a deep relationship with home, but she doesn't remember a lot about home. And her entire life for a period of decade was confined in an IDP camp.
Can you just tell what were the circumstances for why she had to leave? What was Boko Haram doing and that drove so many people from their homes?
Boko Haram is an insurgency that started in the early 2000s and became prominent globally in terms of their brutal attack and displacement of communities. She and her family came from a place called Nganaram, which is about 1 kilometer outside Marfa town. And those who like geography, it's about 50 kilometers outside the capital, Maiduguri. The town was completely burned down. Boko Haram came in, burned down the village, killed, raped, maimed, as they always do. And she was one of the people who were displaced. As part of that displacement, the international community and humanitarian organizations set up internally displaced camps. Those camps are important in saving people's lives, but the conditions in the camps are overcrowded, poor hygiene, and many problems people face in IDP camps, as we know, globally. So we wanted to work with the government and the communities to look at whether we can return people after a decade of displacement. But the challenges of return is, first, do they want to return? Do they remember home? Is there security to return? What are the guarantees that Boko Haram will not come back? So after all those issues were addressed, the government gave us the go-ahead to rebuild those communities. So we wanted to rebuild the town that was erased, but rebuild it better. And how do we do that? We wanted to make sure it was culturally sensitive. They were involved in the process of rebuilding and reimagining their own communities. And it was one of the most unbelievable programs that I've been involved in. And more importantly, it actually appeared in Architectural Digest. It was spread in the story of rebuilding Gararam. And partly is because we had hired a very famous Nigerian architect to work with the community, to look at their cultural heritage, to discuss with them what they want, and designed the place in a way that that Architectural Digest thought it was worth having it in their publication last year.
So they had their whole town had been raised, and they could reimagine something better. What did it look like?
So the community tribe, there's a tribe in northern Nigeria called the Kanuri, one of the biggest tribes in Borno State. They wanted to make sure that the housing were built in a way. In their culture, when you walk into the house, you can't. When you open the door, you don't see straight into the house. It's like there's a small waiting area, and once you go through the waiting area, you have an opening, and then you get into the house. So they wanted us to help them build it in a way that was environmentally friendly. That the heat, it's a very hot place there. They wanted to make sure that the houses were cool and female friendly, and they were involved in that process of design, and we got the architect to help
What does
us.
female friendly look like?
So it's about safety of for them when they get into the house, to make sure that essentially if somebody comes into the first part of the house, people are still protecting themselves in the second part of the house. So it's I don't know how to describe it vividly better than that, but essentially well lit. And many of these houses, with many of these communities we've seen, have a lot of them are women-led, because the men have either died during the conflict, or the fathers have left. So there's a lot of women-led household in those communities. So we wanted them to help design on how the houses will look. It's one of the most incredible community involved design I have been involved in, and I think many people will say that
I'm
was
just curious of course, I worked for the UN Refugee Agency for years, and I know the situation for many refugees stuck or IDPs, and not many of them get a chance to reimagine. They'd love to go back home. How did you get the funding for this? I'm sure it wasn't cheap.
No, it wasn't, but it's much cheaper than running IDP camps for over a decade. Essentially, this is the argument we've made, in the sense that these communities, many of them want to go back home. When the Secretary General came to Borno State and Maiduguri, he spoke to the IDPs, and when he asked them, "What do you want? What do you want your government, and what do you want the UN to support you?" And many of them wanted to go back home. So there's a sense that home, they felt incomplete, even in safety, without the connection to home. So we got a lot of funding, because Germany is one of the biggest funders on stabilization for UNDP. And the idea of stabilization really is to get the government to lead and have the ownership in finding the solutions to the issues of displacement.
How many people were able to return home as a result of this in these reimagined communities?
So one of that specific town, about 7,000 people returned in one town, a small town. We've done about 9 other locations. We build schools, we build clinics, we build security features so that the police and police barracks and police stations and the police return. All those areas, if you look, our figures, 35,000 people returned as within the 9 zones that we were able to do this. But we think indirectly more than 50,000 people returned, because not everybody necessarily gets a house or gets a shelter to go back home. Many people, when they see the police are back, and when they see the army is there, and when they see street lights, and they feel there's a sense of security, they go back by themselves.
The longing for home is always there, and we're going to talk about your story as well. But what does home mean for the IDPs, the internally displaced people, the refugees that you have met?
For those who we spoke to, for them, home is essentially restarting their lives. They've always felt displacement is for them was a sense of incompleteness. And I'll tell you later, I said we'll discuss my own story of displacement. There is something very incomplete when you do not have that, the options of home is removed in your life. Familiarity, belonging. And many people have a strong relationship with the land and the culture around home. So many of them wanted to go back home, and there are many stories of people who felt that And this also happens because there was no opportunity for them but IDP camps. So for them, options were: do I want to stay in IDP camp forever, or do I want to restart my life? And for the government also, they wanted people who voluntarily wanted to go back to go back. So we facilitated that process.
You seem quite proud of this project.
Absolutely, we were very proud because I think it's the UN at its best when we align with priority of government, and more importantly, the needs of the communities we are there to support. So in that sense, I always say that sometimes for those of us who work in development, it's not easy to see results immediately because development can take time. It's government led. Many parts of it involves too much planning and development plans and looking for financing. But seeing development action have immediate direct impact on people's lives. Somebody who lived in an IDP camp, who had their hopes, their aspirations deferred because they were prioritizing their own security, are suddenly back home in dignity, self-reliant, and thinking, now I want to reimagine again what life means for me. So in that sense, yes, I'm very proud.
You mentioned Miriam, and were you able to accompany her or to see her back in her new home? And if so, what was that like?
So Amina is her name, and she wanted. Yes, we followed her. We followed her, and we made a 29-minute documentary story that right now it's going around the film festival circuits in the world, and follows the story of 4 families. One of them is this young lady who was going back home for the first time since she was a teenager. Another one is a story of a woman who lost her husband and is going back as a single mother with 4 kids. Another one is a young man who went as far as Lagos but wanted to go back home, and now he's at home with his young wife and their young child. So we follow the stories of these 4 families, and then we went back months after they went back home and see how they're coping. The most interesting thing of their stories, though, is this: when you're in an IDP camp for a decade or sometimes 6-7 years, you get de-skilled in one area of your ability to restart your livelihood. So if you're a farmer, you're not necessarily skilled as you used to be because you are relying on humanitarian aid to survive. But now you have to go back and farm again, or if you are a cattle keeper, if you're a business person. So we had to accompany them on those. So I don't want to give up. I don't want to give the impression that it was a smooth transition to dependency. It wasn't, and it's still a challenge. But their biggest pride when you talk to them and when you see them is a sense that I'm back home, I have my own destiny in my own hand, and I'm independent. And those things are very powerful.
How did it make you feel witnessing the return of these Nigerians to their own homes and their own communities?
It was very touching. It was the most emotional part of my work that I have ever been involved, seeing them. But also, as we'll come to it later, I have been displaced from my own home as a young person at the age of 3, 4 when we left home in Somalia. And a little bit of me was, I must say, envious of them that they're able to go back home. In that sense, I always imagine how I'll feel when I go back home without fear of security or relationships that may have been fractured because you're distant from people. So in that sense, indirectly, I was essentially living my own internal joy by looking at how they felt, and what future now awaits them.
And maybe you one day, but maybe let's go back there when you were 3 years old and you were living in Somalia with your family and you had to flee. What happened? What were the circumstances there, and what was that journey like?
So my parents were in the Somali government. Both of them were in the at least my father was in working for the government, and we left at early 80s. He left earlier. We followed him later, and the main reason was a sense of fear and political prosecution, because he didn't want to. He was in the army, so he didn't want to be in the army anymore. Somalia had lost a war that 1978 with a war with Ethiopia, and there was a sense that the country wasn't going the way it's supposed to go, and he wanted to leave, but the options were not there, so he had to sneak out and go to Kenya, and then we had to follow him a couple of years later. So we moved to Kenya and moved to the Kenyan coast. For those who are familiar with, I happen to say it's the nicest part of Kenya, the Kenyan coast. So we moved there, and we've been living there since my mother still lives there. So that is home for us now. But there's always a sense of something missing because you're deprived going back to where you were born.
You have not been able to go back since.
I went back as a UN official, but you come in and out, you are locked into the security. But I know I haven't been able to walk around or get a sense this is where I was born, or get to sense, interact with people. You just can't do that, unfortunately, with the insecurity still that plagues the country.
You settled in, was it Mombasa? Or?
Just about 2 hours north of Mombasa, a town called Malindi. That's where we settled.
And
yes.
How was the reception from the local community? How were you and your family received, and what was it? I mean, you were only 3, so probably you were okay. But was it easy to integrate?
Absolutely. I mean, the beauty about the Kenyan coast is there is a unifying culture. Also, there's something unifying about the Swahili culture. Swahili is not a tribe; it's a language, and the minute you learn the language, the minute you are part of that culture, it's a very accepting society. But to be fair, also those days there were no huge numbers of Somali refugees. It was like early 80s. So people are had a larger appetite to accept people coming in. That was very different when the Somali refugees came into their millions. I was in Malindi when the boats were coming from Somalia during the early 90s. I remember the people having sense of fear, or a sense that there are too many people coming and they're taking over our spaces. So there was a bit of a backlash, but that I found it to be natural when people don't know who's coming, and they have a sense that their social fabric may be affected. But I think Kenya has been overall a very generous country for refugees and people who are displaced from all over the region.
No, incredibly generous when you look at the numbers in the years and years, because the situation in Somalia has been so insecure. You haven't even been able to go back, really, except for with your UN passport and under massive security as we travel there. So what about your parents? I mean, how did they feel about, did they feel a longing for Somalia? Did they?
Yeah. My father passed away years later, so he's never had the opportunity to go back, really. He passed in 1998. So for him, he's always wanted, I think there's always that missing piece. There are many people who have left home voluntarily, who may have moved to another country, but they always have an option to fly back, to go walk around where essential to remember your childhood. So he was deprived of all that. He never ended up going back. So that is that's one thing that I've always, the most interesting about home though, and the feelings about home is there's this romantic thing you have about this, beautiful place called home that if you go back, you'll essentially get what you are missing. But there's other fear in me. Maybe if I ever go back home, it won't be as exciting as I had imagined in my romantic self. So it's a very interesting feelings. But I just think not having the option is the most difficult part.
Yeah, I'm sure. I know so many refugees feel that and just would love to have that option, and they're stuck. So you were able to get Kenyan citizenship?
Actually, yesterday, No, because I haven't applied. To be fair, I'm entitled to Kenyan citizenship, but I'm still Somali citizen, and then later I lived in the UK. I left. I call myself double refugee. So then I left the UK as a migrant in my teenagers at 16, 17. Then I lived there until I was until I finished university. So I have a British passport as well.
So you went to the UK to study.
No, I went as an irregular migrant in the UK. So the story was when a lot of Somalis started coming to Kenya, it became very difficult for Somalis, and there was a fear. My mother always felt like, we need to invest in somebody, and you know how. I wrote a report called Scaling Fences on this story of African migrants, and families come together, they resource mobilize within the family, and then they invest in you to go away and to have an opportunity in places such as the UK or the US and others, and you become an investment, and then in my case that investment had paid because I was given an opportunity to study and live in the UK.
But I mean, you were 16 years old. That must have
Yeah.
been, what was that like? Did they sit you down at the dinner table one evening and say, son, you are going to the UK?
No, I can tell you, Melissa, I remember coming back from school with my backpack and being told that you're leaving next day. That's how much. There was not a lot of consultation, I must say.
And how did you get there?
Well, they had some human smugglers those days. So they were paying people, and then the people will take you, and then they'll get you a passport. And you end up landing in London, and once you land in London, they tell you where to go and what to say, and then the guy disappears. So that's essentially what happened. And for me, it was a shock because I had never been to Nairobi. Forget about London. So it was my first trip to a city outside Malindi, apart from Mombasa. It was smaller. So it was a very big eye opener.
So you took a plane.
Yes, we took a plane. Those days it was easier. It was 1993, 94,
I don't
94.
think you could do that now.
No. Now this is why this the Scaling Phases report, which produced by for UNDP, told the story of why irregular migrants migrating and what are the opportunities that they are seeking, and how can the irregular migrant part be formalized. In the older days, people could just go, and now planes are not an option. Visas are impossible to get, so people find a way to go to those places, and
they risk their lives on horrific journeys through deserts, on boats that many of them sink. So in your case, I guess you feel lucky that
very, very, very lucky that we didn't have to do that. But I know many people who come from the same background as mine who have done that journey. I wrote a Guardian article on a young man called Bashir. He's now in Austria. He went through the journey, crossed he went through Iran. Actually, he left Kenya. He went to Iran, crossed to Turkey, from Turkey to Greece, up to he was stopped on the German border and with Austria, and he stayed there now, and he's still there. But his ambition was, he's a young man. He was very vibrant. I know him quite well. I wrote his story, but his is a story of saying that I will not let my circumstances define me or limit my ambition. His ambition was to get world-class education, and he felt that he was actually grew up in Dadaab, in the refugee camp in Kenya. He felt that his ambition there was never going to be met, so he'd rather take the risk.
Was he able to get asylum in Austria?
Yes, he's there. He's got the asylum, but he's lucky. You're right. There are many who are dead, many who drowned. There are many who, But in the report we produced, I had warned policymakers. Then I went around to and many of the European countries, and the message was very clear. if the Sahara and the Mediterranean cannot stop them, no other barriers will stop them. So it's better that we find a formalization, a form of regular migration system, so that we reduce the unnecessary deaths. But more importantly, these are people who are very ambitious, and it's important that you engage with the governments of where they're coming from, so you have a form of a legal migration. Because now there's no other way to migrate if you want to go to richer countries and get opportunities.
And it's not only opportunities, it is contributions.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely,
And
they
many of these
contribute.
countries are desperate for I'm not only speaking of migrant labor, but the kind of expertise that many ambitious young people bring. Once they get educated, they can contribute enormously to
Yeah,
the economies and
absolutely.
enrich the societies with different cultures. But it's why is it such a hot button issue? As somebody who managed to get to the UK yourself,
Yeah.
managed to get educated there, why?
I think there are many reasons. One, I think it is a self-reinforcing problem because there is no legal pathway. People come in irregularly, and because they come in irregularly, it touches on the fear of the unknown. So I always told policymakers that the best way to reduce anti-migrant feeling in your societies is to regularize it, to own the process. Right now, I'll give you an example. I went to Copenhagen, and if you go to Copenhagen, there's one park, and I walked in the park and I saw a lot of African migrants sleeping roughly. And I spoke to an ordinary Danish person. They were really upset that they could not go to their park, which is understandable. I mean, they feel that the parks were occupied, but they're not aware that there's no legal migration. There's no process for these people to not. Where will they go? Because there's no receiving system. So it's a self-reinforcing thing. People are becoming more anti-migrant because there's no pathway for legal migration, and because there's no pathway for legal migration, more and more people vote extreme parties into power, thinking that is the way to stop it. They overpromise they won't be able to stop it because people will come until you have legal pathways. And this is it takes a level of courage to do this, and that hasn't happened.
Well, I think you're an example of why they should do it. You studied where in the UK?
I went to SOAS, School of Oriental African Studies. I studied there, and I did both my undergrad and master's there. And for me, as I said, when I remember the discussion with my mother when she was sending me, her message was one thing: education. Go there. Don't be distracted by anything else. You have an opportunity to be educated, and that is the opportunity that I took.
But you arrived at 16 all alone.
Yeah.
Where did you go?
They put you in a children's home and foster parents. So I had few foster parents, a wonderful Eritrean family who I lived with until I was 18. The local council is well set up for unaccompanied refugees. But just to say, all that would not have happened if there was no refugee convention. So people sometimes don't understand the importance of this international value system that we have signed up to. And I every time I hear the negative perspective of people saying these conventions should not work, or what is the UN convention doing for me, I tell them it has done so much for me. Without that, I would not have been accepted in the UK.
And then what motivated you? Your background as a refugee, as a migrant, did that have any or factor into your motivation for working for the UN?
Absolutely. I first I didn't when I finished university, I wanted to go to the city like every young man, young woman, go make money in the finance sector, and so I joined. I joined a company there, but I only lasted 1 month. I knew immediately it wasn't for me. So I quit. Then I So I was all over the place for the first few months after finishing university. Then I joined an NGO, volunteered for the NGO, but I negotiated for them to pay my rent because I thought I can't, I can't volunteer and be not paid. So they were paying my rent and they gave us some stipend. So from there is when I realized this is what I want to do and work in the development sector. I went to Sao Tome and Principe for the first. The NGO sent me there to work, and then that's when I realized the importance and the power of the UN on the ground, and that's what inspired me then to want to join.
Where did you go? Sorry.
Sao Tome and Principe, small little island of West Africa. The population 150,000, most wonderful people, Portuguese speaking. This is where I first went to work for International Alert. I opened the office there. I was in my early 20s.
And so how did you get into the UN?
So I got in the UN, same place I met my wife. So I after Sao Tome, I went to Liberia for the same NGO, and then we had a partnership with the NGO I was working for called International Alert with UNDP. So I was sitting inside UNDP offices and working, but hired by the NGO, and then I got a job with them, and that's the same place I met my wife. She was also working for UNDP in Liberia. So Liberia is an important part of our story, our family story.
Very, and you met her very young too.
Yes, we met, and she was working in a place called Hapa. There's a border between Liberia and Ivory Coast. So, but every time she used to come to Monrovia on the way to R&R, this is where we met, and yeah.
Where is she from?
She's Swedish. She's from southern Sweden, a place called Malmo. So she's I met her there, and
I believe there are a lot of Somalis in Sweden.
a lot, yes. I only found out after when I'm going for when I met my wife, and part of the marriage agreement is I have to go to Christmas there, and it's very cold, as you can imagine. And summer holidays is when I got to find there's a lot of Somalis in Sweden. Yeah, Sweden has been a very generous country for refugees.
So what was that cold like when you first went to Sweden for Christmas?
Oh, I up to today I can tell you, every time I go there for Christmas, I if I stay there for a week, I hardly leave the house. I resist it because it's just. I keep asking my Swedish in-laws how they find that, but they're used to it.
They're used to it.
And
so no amount of down jackets and clothes.
No. They have the Swedes always say it's not about the weather, is whatever you're wearing, the clothes you wear. And I really don't believe in that, because whatever layers of clothes I put on, I still feel the cold. So
was your wife able to keep working also for the UN and be based in places that you were based? Because I know it's often difficult to
absolutely
maintain in these international lifestyles. It's tough.
Yeah. So she's been very lucky because she does. She works for UNHCR. She worked for UNHCR in Nigeria. Now we're going to Pakistan. She wants to take a few months break and then see what she wants to do.
Excellent. And do you have children?
Yes, we have a 7-year-old girl. We have one child, yes.
So she is going to have an interesting life, already has.
She has very interesting life. But I'm sure many of our colleagues who work in the UN will identify with this. At that young age, it's fine, but there's always this sense that we always have to move after a certain period of time. And she like the breaking away from her friends and predictability and all those things can be very challenging. But we hope that she's still a bit young to not to be too affected by the movement.
You're going to Pakistan now.
Yes.
And you're changing roles. Also, you were working in development for, as we mentioned, for the UN development program, and you're going to now take up the function of being the resident coordinator in Pakistan. What does that job entail?
I'm really excited about this new job. It's very different. It gives you an opportunity to see a broader perspective. As a UNDP head, I was the development head of the UN system. Now I am tasked to work across the entire UN presence in Pakistan and be the humanitarian coordinator to support Pakistan's development ambition, its acceleration to meet the SDGs, but also its ability to deal with climate-induced crises such as floodings and other forms of climate-related impact. So exciting times. So I'm looking forward to that. And the UN has a huge presence in Pakistan. So
Yeah. What keeps you awake at night?
well, I'm telling you, like rest of the world right now, we're all awake because there's so many multiple crises that the world is facing, and I don't think we've had this kind of coming together of several crises, be it the climate crisis. I have a 7-year-old. Will the world be the same for her when she's at my age? Violence all over the world, conflicts in Europe, conflicts in Africa, conflicts in the Middle East. How can that be managed or reduced? How can we remind governments about what they have signed up to, the international law and international order? So all those things are concerning. But as I said, we are the UN in the business of hope and selling hope and selling that the tomorrow the world will be better than it is today. Yes, many things concern me, including climate risk, but I also think we signed up to this job to work for the UN, to do what we do so that we can help the world so it can be a better place for everybody, including my own daughter.
And when you think about your daughter, you mentioned that, and when she is your age, what would you hope that world would look like for her?
I hope it will be a world that hasn't been destroyed by my generation or the previous generation through our actions today, through intolerance or climate emissions, but also a world that is better for girls and boys alike, especially for her. She's a mixed race child. She's a girl, and I want her to, like everybody else, achieve her potential and not in any way affected or discriminated because she's a girl or anything else.
Well, we all have a lot of work to do to work towards that goal. And so, Mo, thank you so much for joining us in Awake at Night. Good luck in Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Awake at Night. We'll be back soon with more incredible and inspiring stories from people working against huge challenges to make this world a better and safer place. To find out more about the series and the extraordinary people featured, do visit un.org/awake-at-night. Do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please take the time to review us. It helps more people find the show. Thanks to my editor, Bethany Bell, to Adam Paler, Josie LeBlond, and my colleagues at the UN, Katerina Katidi, Roberta Politi, Geneva Damayanti, Tulin Batiki, Becerra Kostova, Angelica Davis, Carlos Macias, and the team at the UN studio. The original music for this podcast was written and performed by Nadine Shaw and produced by Ben Hillier. Additional music was by Pascal Wise.